Well, we're looking in Genesis tonight, the 6th chapter, one of the most important chapters of the Bible, because this is the description of Noah and the flood that God sent upon this earth in punishment and in wrath for the sinfulness of man. Now, last week we began our look in Genesis 6 with some very, unusual things, wasn't it? There was the story of the sons of God. Now, who were these sons of God? We looked at that, and that's still we could talk, and you could have this person say, well, they were angelic beings, and no, they were the sons of Seth, and as persons have biblical arguments for both sides. Whoever they were, I know Satan is involved. He was involved. He was trying to destroy the creation of God and trying to throw a wrench into God's plan to bring a Redeemer. And things got so bad that he was going to, in fact, the earth got so bad that God was going to have to destroy it. And so Genesis chapter 6 is really the story of the condemnation of things. And to understand the world we live in, it has to be understood through the eyes of this chapter. Because we don't live in the world that Adam lived in, or of the generations after that. We live in the world that was affected in the days of Noah. And so we have a world that does not, I don't believe, resembles probably the original creation, because it was totally destroyed with the flood. Now, the story of Genesis 6, we looked at the first few verses about the imaginations and being so evil and the wickedness was going on everywhere. But the Bible has about one man here that kept on track. Now, remember, in chapter 5 of Genesis, we looked at the genealogy of Seth. And remember, Seth was another son of Adam, who God used to bring a line people who walked with God in a greater way than the people of the line of Cain. The line of Cain became a very evil generation of people, generations of people seeking everything but to please God. And so Noah is an ancestor from Adam, from the line of Seth. And because people live so long, as we looked at the time slots, Adam lived 930 years, okay? We believe, I said last week, that probably the flood came after the creation time, probably somewhere between 1,015 to 1,200 to 1,500 years, probably in that range, okay? So, when some of Noah knew directly, overlapping, Adam and his people, okay? So they had firsthand information about God's creation. And they understood who God was because Adam had seen him, Adam walked with him, and Adam experienced wrath, and he understood these things. So there was no excuse about, wonder what God was like and all these things. They had an understanding of that because Adam and his first generation of people, many of them who were either just died or were still living at the time of the flood. Okay, it's hard to understand, but that's what we see. So there was plenty of understanding of things. Now, we have a great story of Noah, first of all. We'll read that verse as we see there in Genesis. And these are the generations of Noah. And Noah was a just man and perfect in his generation, and Noah walked with God. Now, one of Noah's ancestors, which was Enoch, also was said to walk with God, you remember. And in fact, God took him because he took him out before the flood, before the wrath. Now, Noah was a man who walked with God. He was well-pleasing, and so God used Noah to be the one who built an ark to save humanity from total destruction. Now, what it means that he is what? Noah was a just man. And in fact, let me back up. Let me see here. Let me go back and look at this verse before that too. I want to look at verse 8 there on the screen too. But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. Okay, that's very important because we just understood the former verses that people were wicked and going to be punished, but Noah found grace. Now, what is grace? It's just grace is the same in Noah's day as it is our day. Grace is unmerited favor toward us by God, bestowed upon us for nothing we did, nothing could do, but He provided something that we couldn't provide for ourselves. Noah was saved by grace the same way we're saved by grace. Okay? And this, you got to say, this is way before the law was given to Abraham, many centuries before that. And so there was no written law, there wasn't anything like that, but there was the law that they knew they broke because they were sinners, they were wicked. And Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. Why did he find grace? Well, he humbled himself to accept God's way. He accepted what God had said. So much of the rest of humanity were just doing their own thing, weren't they? Noah found just grace in the eyes of the Lord. These are the generations of Noah. Noah was a just man. Now, when we say just man, what does that mean?
Righteous.
He was righteous. He was in the New Testament. We use the word justified. That means we were declared righteous by God, weren't we? So we were a just man. And just like Noah, he was perfect in his generation. That doesn't mean he was sinless. None of us can be sinless because we find that low, so he wasn't perfect, but we would probably use the word was more blameless. He was living a life that was not contrary to what God said. Okay? He was living a life seeking purity. When people saw Noah, they couldn't find things to say, well, look at that Noah, the way he's acting. He's just acting like the rest of these sinners. They couldn't find that with Noah. And so Noah was a man who walked with God. And that's important because we find that so much civilization was not. And find, when we get down to the end, after Noah preached and preached and preached, there wasn't like a bunch of converts wanting to get on the ark. Isn't that hard to believe, isn't it? It just didn't. They just wasn't. Some of them say, well, maybe he's right. No, none of them, except his family, the daughter-in-laws, and his wife. That was all. That was all the people that got on the ark that day. And they didn't. They just felt that Noah was just, Noah, you're just out of touch. No, this rain thing, this big ark, you're a nut. I could just see him saying that. We're not going to get on this thing with you, all those stinky old animals. Forget it. We're going to do our own thing. We're going to eat. We got parties to go to. We're going to eat, drink, and be merry. We don't have time for this, and they just went their own ways. And even after they've seen all these animals sort of gathering toward the ark, the animals, see, they were smarter. They listened to God. And here comes all these animals, and they got an ark. But people evidently didn't even stop and say, well, maybe we could get on the ark. There wasn't even anyone, God says, that was wanting to get on the ark. So Noah built a ship, the ark. God warns him of a coming universal flood and made him to construct a ship. And it was basically a big floating rectangular box made of cypress wood. It was 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, and 45 feet high. Huge sailing ship. Now, it was basically a big barge, is basically what it was. It wasn't made to be really having to sail. It was just made to float. It didn't have a rudder. It didn't have anything on. It was just like a big old barge. And, big old barges can hold a lot of weight. When you go down across the Ohio River and they got those big old barges full of coal. They don't do anything but be pushed by that other boat. They don't do anything, but they float real well with a lot of weight on it. And so basically God just designed a big old barge with big old walls and a roof for Noah to survive on with all these animals. And so it was huge. It was plenty big, and we're going to look at some of the other things about that in just a few minutes. And so let me go and just look at some of the aspects around the flood world, around the flood, okay? Let's look at that. So what was the pre-flood world like? What was the world like Noah lived in like prior to the great flood, was doubtless very different from today. Okay, so the world post-flood is totally different from the world pre-flood. Totally different. First thing, it was probably universally warm with pleasant, mild climate. We don't believe there was probably any ice caps or polar caps of anything of this sort. There was, as we said before, there was probably some kind of shield around this, and it just kept a perfect climate. We find plant life in the fossil records, in the poles. So at one time even the poles were tropical. So there was a perfect world. It had no deserts or ice caps. The land surface was more extensive, with the oceans much smaller. I believe we have 75% ocean now. I believe it was much smaller. There was much more land and less water. Why is there so much water? Well, there was a lot of water on the earth at the time. We were looking at where did the water go. Well, what land was after the flood? The pushing of these plates and these lands began to come up, and ocean bottoms began to drop lower, where all the water filled those things. And we got our ocean bases. And the land that basically we see today, I'm looking at a map on the back wall back there, is basically the high points that came up after the flood, after the water began to run down. And so at one time, the world was more land. And like I've said before, people say, well, how could God couldn't have sustained all the life that he was planning to in this world? There would have been plenty of room. Why? Because there had been all kinds of land. It would have been 100% producing food. Before the flood, if you lived on the exact North Pole, you'd go out and be eating fresh fruits and vegetables year round. You wouldn't have had any trouble with food. No matter where it was, you'd had food. And it would have been producing year in, month after month after month. So there was plenty of that. Lush vegetation, I say, thrived worldwide. It was differently in there was evidently no rainfall. It was sort of watered through, coming up through the earth and that sort, and it was a perfect condition, like a greenhouse. Somebody asked this question: how advanced was the pre-flood civilization? There's some interesting things that was found over the whole world over time. In fact, this person here wrote a book, and he was not a Christian, so he tried to attempt that our world one time was visited by little green men, which is probably not true. But he made some interesting findings. He found, first of all, there was a landing strip built many centuries ago in Peru. Where was it? What was landing strips for? That's interesting. There was long, ancient concrete constructions in Bolivia. Drawings of spaceships in Mexico. Glass-like bits of rocks called tektites, in which radioactive aluminum isotopes have been discovered in Lebanon. Finds of cut crystal lenses indicating electrochemical activity. Electric dry batteries found in Baghdad. Ornaments of smelted platinum in Peru. Parts of a belt made of aluminum in an ancient grave in China. And so people have found all kinds of things buried, and and things that demonstrate that this world that it might have been quite advanced. Why don't we have much proof of that now? Because it got all washed away in a flood. I mean, the worldwide flood of Noah's day was a tremendous. It was terrible. It wasn't just like a bad rainstorm. It was terrible, of the waters from the deep lifting up. And you see, as you look at the scriptures, as we see in here, the waters from the deep came up, and the waters from above came down. Okay, and so the waters of deep come up. It came up in huge amounts of water. Water waves come down. If this canopy, if it broke, it would have been the deluges of water. When I was at the Creation Museum over in where Answers in Genesis has in Covington, Kentucky, he has a little video of artistic things of what it looked like, and he draws this thing, and it looked like an earth with just a wave of water, just like a big tsunami, just going across the across the earth and just wiping out everything. I mean, it would have been torrential. And so it wiped out everything. It just wiped out civilization. It wiped out ruins. It wiped out people. It wiped out everything that possibly could be at that time. I'm going to jump down here to an extra set in our study guide here on added information on the flood, an overview of things. In fact, somebody said, when did the flood begin? He did some research, and he believed it began to be in our year November, in our month November. I don't know how they come up with that, but that's what he says it did. How long did the flood last? I believe it last 371 days. That's in the scriptures where we get to how much time the water came down, how much time the water rose, and then how much time it took the water to begin to go down. So over 1 year, he was in the ark. And we were talking there a little bit before, after Noah probably used the ark for many years afterwards. Because after the waters came down and he landed on Mount Ararat, he had a big house still to live in. That was the only thing left. And so there he was, probably many years left in that big ark, probably part of it for his living quarters. What triggered the flood? Dr. Henry Morris. And that's a good name to remember in creationism, worldwide floods, is Dr. Henry Morris. He lived he did a lot of writings in the 50s to help people understand the floods. A secondary source of water is postulated existing in vast subterranean heated and pressurized reservoirs in the earth mantle. The actual trigger to unleash these stored waters may have been an earthquake. And the earthquake would not only allow the underground waters to surface through the fractured earth, but would also result in an immense amount of dust blown skyward, which would then initiate the condensation and precipitation of the water canopy. And so you understand the catastrophic thing that was happening. Because a lot of times people get a flood view and they're unsaved and they're secularists and they just think of a hard rainstorm. How in the world can a hard rainstorm flood the whole earth? It was much more than a hard rainstorm. It was catastrophic. Maybe it was this earthquake. Some has even said it could have been a huge meteor that busted through, got sent to bust through the covering above the earth, and it burst into the earth and caused a lot of this reaction. Whatever it was, God sent it. God allowed it to happen, God caused it to happen in order to bring across this catastrophic event. Was the flood universal? Of course we believe the Bible is universal. There's always some that says, well, there was probably a flood, but it was probably just in Noah's day, Noah's area. That's where it was, okay? But it doesn't make any sense. First of all, the need for an ark, okay? If it was only just in Noah's, he could have just walked away. He could have said, hey, you guys, I'm leaving. But if you want to stay here and go through the big flood, you go, but we're going over here. And it would have been simple to do that. Of course, they had to have an ark. They had to have something to protect them. And then the wide distribution of man before the flood. Evidently, man had been scattered by this time all over the earth. Cain had been, and his descendants had been moving. And we're told that all men died all over the earth. There's a comparison between the historical flood judgment in the Bible and the coming fire judgment one day when God destroys the whole earth by fire, because he said he wouldn't destroy the earth again by flood. It wouldn't make sense if it was just a little local flood, but I'm going to destroy the earth someday in a little local fire. No, it was a universal flood. Just like someday there's a universal fire, God's going to purge the earth once and for all to purify it into a new heaven, a new earth. God promised to Noah that he wouldn't flood the earth again. Wherever there's local floods, there's been lots of local floods, so that wouldn't have held up. God wouldn't have had a truth. Then there's flood traditions in ancient civilizations and cultures. Many say if you go back many years and there's always evidence of people having these not only biblical documentation, but there's local historical documentations of stories passed down after the descendants of Noah began to spread around. Hey, man, there was a huge flood one day. It destroyed everything. Well, for generations, that story was what? Passed down. You don't go through something like that and don't talk about it. You know, when Shem, Ham, and Japheth would have their kids, they said, "Man, you never believe the flood that we had." You know, it was. You would have talked about that, and the next generation. You know, people still talk about the 1985 flood here in Buchanan, don't they? Wow, it's a big flood. You know, we got places all over that. Just think, the universal flood would have been passed down orally for centuries and centuries, where people documented that, and it's found in different places. Marine fossils on top of mountains. We all know about those. Here in West Virginia, you can find fossils up on top of mountains everywhere in the world like that. The existence of fossil fish beds all over the world. The thing about the reason fossils are so important is if it wasn't something cataclysmic, they wouldn't have destroyed and covered things up immediately. If fish, and some of the fish probably survived the flood. There's probably many of them, of course, they didn't because they're fossils. The reason they didn't is because you got the catastrophic water just churning up huge amounts of stuff. All the vegetation from the earth being put down on top of it. And fossils are not formed from things that's dying gradually, floating to the top of the water because they would have just rotted away. They're formed when all that vegetation smashes them down and settles on them. And could you imagine in a world that was basically full of vegetation, okay? Everywhere on earth that had land was lush in vegetation. That means trees and everything. So all of a sudden, all of that stuff is just picked up and washed away. Some people think there's probably just miles of this stuff, gathered up, and then eventually would just fall and sink on top of all this fish life and animal life, and that's what caused the fossils. And that's the reason here on top of West Virginia mountains you find fossils of animals and vegetation, because all that stuff just came down on top of them and formed. They couldn't deteriorate; they formed a fossil. And that's the only way fossils formed. Now man, there's only so much fossils of man, and most of these animals and things. The people that lived on Earth, as I think Mr. Whiteley described to us, they would have had enough smarts to probably keep trying to get away from the water. As the water would keep rising, they would probably go higher and higher until they couldn't go higher anymore. And then they would probably be washed away more, instead of all at once, probably scattered. And they probably didn't had all the stuff on top of them like the animal life would have to form all the fossils, is what mostly likely for that reasoning. So all these things is evidence of a worldwide universal flood. How destructive would a worldwide flood be? And he talks about even how you can see how things in our world we live in, how destructive they can be. In 1960, a 100-foot wave traveling 550 miles an hour hit the coast, drowning 665 people. Can you imagine a 100-foot wave traveling over 500 miles an hour? When all this floods, if a huge earthquakes happen that trigger this, they trigger the tsunamis. We've seen that here when was it here a few years ago over with Indonesia, when they figured 100,000 people died. This is modern time. It's not even listed in this because this has happened after these things is written here. So an earthquake triggered a tsunami which just wiped out 100,000 people in today's world. Could you imagine with earthquakes much more greater, sending tsunamis around the world like that, and what kind of destructive force it would have with all the water? Again, in Portugal, 1755, the city was hit by a 70-foot wave, drowning 65,000. And here's one in Indonesia again. They must get hit a lot with them. In 1883, a 150-foot wave to Russia's shore sank 33 European vessels, buried many islands beneath a 9-foot layer of mud, destroyed more than 1,000 coastal cities, and left over 50,000 dead in a terrible wake. So all these things describe the type of evidence we'd have. Dr. Morris later on visualized then a great hydraulic cataclysmic bursting upon the present world, with currents of water pouring perpetually from the skies and erupting continuously from the earth's crust all over the world for weeks on end until the entire globe was submerged, accompanied by an outpouring of magma from a mantle and gigantic earth movements, landslides, tsunamis, and explosions. Sooner or later, all land animals would perish. Many, but not all, marine animals would perish. Human beings would swim, run, climb, and attempt to escape the flood, but unless a few managed to ride out the cataclysmic and unusual strong, watertight, seaborne vessels, they would eventually all drown or otherwise perish. Soils would soon erode away from the trees, and plants would be uprooted and carried down toward the sea in great mass of the flooding streams. Eventually, the hills and mountains themselves would disintegrate and the flow downstream in great landslides and turbulent currents. Slabs of rock would crack and bounce and gradually be rolled into boulders and gravel and sand. Vast seas of mud and rock would flow downriver, trapping many animals, rafting great masses of plants with them. On the ocean bottom, upwelling sediments and subterranean waters and magma would entomb hordes of invertebrates. The water would undergo rapid changes in heat and salinity. Great slurries would form, and immense amounts of chemicals would be dissolved and dispersed throughout the seaways. Eventually, the land sediments and water would come with those in the ocean. Finally, the sediment would settle out as the water slowed down. Dissolved chemicals would precipitate out at a time and place where the salinity and the temperatures permitted. The great beds of sediment would soon be cemented into rock, would be formed all over the world. The above, of course, is only the barest outline of the great variety of phenomena that would accompany such a cataclysmic event. So how big was Noah's Ark? It was, as we said, all this time, it was 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, 45 feet high. It had a deck total of 97,700 square feet, or the equivalent to more than the area of 20 standard college basketball courts. Its total volume was around 1,500,000 cubic feet, and the gross tonnage exceeded some 14,000 tons. And that's just some of the ideas about how big it was. And in the story, in the studies here, there's plenty of room for animals. There would be plenty of room for all in the 3 layers of the ark. They say, in fact, they figured out it'd take 150 boxcars today's world to put the animals of Noah's day in there. So there's plenty of room for that. And how did Noah feed and keep those animals for an entire year? Well, this is things you can read, but you figure, there's plenty of vegetation on earth to store up. The earth was full of grains and fruits and vegetables, and basically, a large part of the container, the barge, would hold all kinds of those fruits and vegetables and grains, and they would be stored in there for an easy amount of time. The grains would last for years. So Noah was he'd have to put not only food for the time in the ark. There's going to be a little while before food is going to start being plentiful on earth again after the flood. So they had a long time, probably to dry things, get them ready to store on the ark. There was plenty of vegetables and fruits, and of course I'm thinking, too, there's other things that can, when you're on an ark and you've got chickens, well, you're going to have eggs to eat, so you can eat the eggs. When they got off the ark, there was going to be animals to eat. This one thing about the animals on the ark, there was some people, sometimes you mistakenly think there's only 2 of every animal. There's 7 pairs of clean animals, okay? So every clean animal in God's world, God says He brought 7 pairs of those animals in Genesis chapter 7. Of the unclean, there was only a pair of the clean. So all the clean animals, there was plenty of animals on there, and they would begin producing offspring. Probably, maybe time Noah got off the boat, there was already offspring. And so the food supply would start to be already, to have some food to eat, the meats. And of course, before the flood, they weren't eating meats. It was vegetarian. After the flood, God says now that you could eat the animal life. And so they became meat eaters, some of them. But so there's plenty of food, and they brought plenty of food on the ark, and there's plenty of food for the animals probably to eat there, and for the people, and water supply, and so they probably had huge amounts of water supplies and to feed everything, and so that's how it all happened. And one of the questions, were there dinosaurs on the ark? Well, I think so, probably small dinosaurs. Later on, we know that there's some evidence in some of the caves, out there they find in the world where people used to live in, there's drawings of dinosaurs. Okay, now, for one of the other things about ancient man, they didn't make up things, they only drew what they saw. And so they were seeing these things. Wow, let's go draw a picture of that. They didn't have any snapshots. It'd be nice if they would have had cameras and had a little picture for us, but they didn't have a snapshot, but they did have a drawing. And the drawing is what they saw. So there's drawings of dinosaurs. We have the recording of Job, the oldest book of the Bible, who talks about the behemoth. And this talks about, it couldn't be an elephant. He talks about having a tail like a cedar. Tails. I think God just, when he made a big old elephant, he put that little tail on him. Looks like a rope. That's just to confuse the people later on who's going to try to say that it was the elephant with the behemoth, because everybody looks at that elephant, that big tail, and says, no, that's not a behemoth. And so then he talks about Leviathan. That was it would be an ancient marine dinosaur, and that was in Job's day. So they begin to be wiped out, of course. And animals can get wiped out. We wipe out animals all the time, and there's not much evidence of them. They say sometimes, well, why aren't there some evidence of dinosaurs in some parts or some animals in some parts of the world? Well, it just doesn't happen. Just like in our country, there was millions of buffalo, and there's not hardly, unless there's, only way we have any buffalo today because we artificially came in and stopped the killing of it and put them on reserves. If it wasn't for that, there wouldn't be a sign of a buffalo. And there wouldn't be any bones left because they wouldn't have been any fossilized buffalo. And at one time there was millions of buffalo running across the United States, and if it wasn't for us stepping in with some reserves, there wouldn't be a sign of a buffalo. We'd say, what was a buffalo? We'd see these Indians' drawings. Well, that's a buffalo. What's a buffalo? They got wiped out, except for we stepped in and saved some. That's the same way with dinosaurs. They probably, they got wiped out, and they got hunted and everything, and they got taken out. There's also, if you have your book, there's much more to read on that. I can't read everything in there. Where did all the flood waters go? Okay, some people ask that. Well, like I said, after the flood, after the waters started coming down, after the waters stopped coming up, but then it leveled off, it's at that time we believe there was a lot of shifting in the Earth's surface. And these tectonic plates, and they begin to shift and move, and that's what brought big mountains up and everything. So they probably begin to rise up. We understand that the oceans were probably not as deep as they are now. And evidently the ocean, the earth sort of opened up this underneath where the waters came out. Well, then it had great chasms of canyons like we do in the Atlantic and the Pacific, and water began to suck back down into there. Okay, and so then as time went, the water, the earth would be raising, the water would be running off. Many believe who understand the flood believe like things like the Grand Canyon was formed at that time. By the huge amounts of runoff, and the earth, it didn't happen over millions of years with the little Colorado River running through it. It happened with huge amounts of water rushing and flowing and just carving out. At that time would have been a rock that was soft. It was mud-like forming, and it just, all that water running through everything, it carved out all kinds of things. And then when it was over, there was all this stuff sticking up, and finally it hardens into rock over hundreds of years, and then is what we have today. We see the Grand Canyon, we see all those strange looking things out west. How in the world did they get formed like that? It's probably formed after all the water runs off and these things at that time. Other thing about the arks, has there been ark sightings? Yeah. Mount Ararat, the Bible tells us, was landed on Mount Ararat. Mount Ararat is in Turkey, and there was different places who have seen some evidence of it. It's in a strange place, it's not easy to get to. And then in modern times, since the Turks and different things had it, they didn't like a lot of people over there looking around and stuff. But there's been some pilots who has filmed, has videoed some stuff or took some pictures of things of this. And there's eyewitness reports since 1840 provides these things. The ship is half buried in a partly melted lake. Its altitude is about 13,000 feet. And the inside of the ark is filled with wooden separators. These are people that's actually been there and looked at things. The outside and inside of the cover with a heavy varnish or lacquer. The wood is extremely hard, almost petrified. It would be. Wood petrifies after a time if it's under the right conditions. When I was a kid, I remember visiting the petrified forest out west. And that's where all them trees knocked down. I don't know what caused that to be petrified. Anyone ever know that? I was pretty young when I went there. I don't know what the story was. But all the trees are just laid down out there, but they're like rock now. They're not like wood. And so there's all kinds of things. If you got that book, it'd be well worth reading that about the people that has actually been around there and saw these things, gives some testimony to it. So it was still there. So lots of things there in this book. If you got the Wilmington Guide, you can go back and look at a lot of that stuff. It'd take me too long to even try to read all of this. I'd like to give you some more tonight on this, but I know it's been going a long time and there's a lot of stuff, but there's just so much information there. I just wanted to give you a big sort of a picture of the cataclysmic event it was. And that there's never been an event like it. That was the only time it ever happened, and it never happened again. But we live in a world that was affected by this thing called the flood. And there's all kinds of evidence of it, there's proof of it, and there's all the things we need to know right from the Bible about the importance of this event in the days of Noah. Anybody got any questions of this evening? Any comments?
I always heard that Noah stayed on the ark for 40 days and 40 nights, and he sent out a bird to find.
Well, no, he stayed on the ark for over 370 days. The Bible talks about the storm lasting for 40 days and 40 nights, okay? And then the water began to raise. And then later on, we look in the other chapters, Noah, to see if the dry land was beginning to form yet, he sent out the birds, remember? And the birds, when they finally didn't come back and things, when they came back with the leaf and things, they knew the land was forming. So he was on there over here because it would have took a long time for it to go down. And even after he got off the ark, he was probably still, there was probably lots of the world that was still underwater. It would have took a long time for it to, and I wish I could, maybe I have to mention this next week about the ice caps and things, how being formed, because there's a lot of stuff happening in the next hundreds of years after the flood. It totally changed the climate of the world. Okay, but we better wait another time to finish a little bit of that up. Okay, we better stop on this one here, a long time on this one, then I'll give a few other things.